Thank you for joining us today. The event that's jointly put on by the UDG and cpre. And it is really, really important issue, car parking. We all know it in our day-to-day lives, and it has an astonishingly impact on our environment. I'm Katja Stille, chair of the Urban Design Group, and I'm pleased to welcome you, and kind of really great you could make the time out of your busy days. We always enjoy collaborating with our partners like the cpre and jointly push forward the kind of people-friendly agenda that the UDG has written on its flag. Today we will talk about why is parking policy so important, what evidence is there that it's not, and that it is not used to full effect, and what changes can local authorities do. We will hear from three very knowledgeable speakers, and then we have a little bit of a discussion afterwards. Before handing over to Alice, I just want to outline why I and the UDG think that parking is such an important issue. I think if we manage to unlock a new approach to delivering parking, we will be much closer to meeting our aims of creating people-friendly and sustainable environments. In my view, the traditional view of accommodating cars in our developments is a barrier to creating better places where people may want to choose to walk or cycle, or actually creating pedestrian, people and children-friendly streets and spaces. It also stops us from delivering more compact densities and using our land efficiently. A standard suburban development approach is giving more land to car parking than to family homes or nature. This does show where we put our priorities to a certain extent, and I think we might want to change that if we think about it carefully. I think we can't expect a seismic shift in people's lifestyles and outlooks overnight. And there's also a significant funding gap for sustainable transport infrastructure, which is essential to make that switch happen. And at the moment, a lot of developments, they leave people without choice. So they can only use the car because nothing else is available to them, particularly in the outer urban areas. But I think we don't necessarily have to wait for the kind of whole policy context to change. We can start thinking of and designing car parking in a more future-facing and flexible way. There are approaches that allow us to refocus the way we use land on people and nature, and also allow to design parking in a way that we can change that land use over time when maybe those parking spaces aren't available or needed anymore. For example, thinking of the suburban model of semi-detached houses with 2 or more parking spaces on plot. That spread out type of development and those parking spaces are there forever. It's really hard to change that fabric afterwards. But we can start thinking about these things differently. And I think we need to start thinking about planning and designing the infrastructure differently. So, and supported with obviously the sustainable transport infrastructure, the walking and cycling routes, the public transport routes. And for me, that means in the short term, accommodating, for example, car parking in shared parking areas, in car barns and on street, pulling it out of those individual plots. Because I think that is hardwiring into developments, a lifestyle that is not changeable, and in my view, hopefully not, it's not environmentally friendly and hopefully will become outdated. So we can use those clustered parking areas in the future for green space or additional housing. Clustering parking will also allow us to create more attractive streets and developments. And this can happen today or tomorrow while we continue to push for changes in policy and try to kind of lobby for different lifestyles. This is one proposition that I'm kind of putting forward, and we try to kind of adapt in our day-to-day work, working with councillors and local authorities and highway authorities, trying to kind of promote this switch of thinking about accommodating parking in different ways, more future, flexible ways. But I'm sure there are lots of other opinions, and I think our speakers have a lot to say on that subject as well. So at this time, I stop talking and I will hand over to Alice, who will take you through that day.
So So as I said, I'm from CPRE London. It might not be the countryside charity. It might not be immediately obvious why we're interested in parking, but I'm going to come to that. This is my parklet outside my house, and this is in Hackney. And so it's just a way to start to introduce the idea that parking can be and needs to be something else. So I'm also I meant to say I'm also the coordinator of the London Healthy Street Scorecard Coalition, and that's a coalition of transport campaigners around London, and we're campaigning to essentially to shift mode shift, so to meet the mayor's targets to shift most of the car, to reduce car journeys and to increase active travel and to reduce road deaths and injuries, serious injuries, to zero. So why does parking matter to us? Well, traffic, every car journey starts and ends in a parking space. So if parking is unrestricted, more people drive. There's lots of evidence on that. I'm not going to go through it today, but certainly we can provide you with links to evidence if that's of use. The second reason is space. And, a space the size of 10 hired parks in London is given up to curbside parking alone, and that excludes other types of parking, for instance, that like you might find at a retail park or on private land. And then thirdly, the issue of urban realm, which of course for the Urban Design Group is of great interest, and in particular around residential streets, but also historic settings and town centres, all of which can benefit from changes to parking. So more specifically, reducing traffic is also obviously clearly linked to climate, air quality, reducing noise and road danger. There's a link to health, because if you can reduce traffic, you can promote active and shared and sustainable travel. You get more people walking and cycling. There's also a need to tackle deficiency of green space, and we've just seen a whole street being turned into a park in central London. I'll have a picture for you later. We need to deliver green infrastructure, so we need to convert grey space to green, and that's partly for sustainable urban drainage systems, also temperature management within the city, where grey space leads to the urban heat island effect. We need to deliver much safer streets. In fact, we need to deliver safe streets. We need to support the local economy, local economic recovery following COVID, and even parking even obviously relates to that, and I can come on to that. So finally, and perhaps most central to CPRE London, is saving the countryside, and that's about compact cities versus urban sprawl, which I'll come on to. So why is now the time for change? Well, parking policy is absolutely key to combating all of these issues we face at the moment, but it's also one of the most effective tools that local authorities can use to reduce car use, and it's really about much more than just providing parking spaces. So what we started to do was to do a preliminary assessment of borough parking policies, and we just noticed an extremely low ambition in using parking policy to tackle really serious issues. So we decided to try to create a benchmark of what we thought a really good policy would look like, and to start to ask people to challenge their local authorities to do more. And we'll talk more about the detail of that after I've spoken. So the other thing which I alluded to a bit earlier, which is that parking policy is kind of falling between the gaps of the different campaigns, if you like. So for example, you may primarily talk about road danger or cycling or walking or climate or pollution, but parking policy impacts on all of these things, and it's not central to any one of those organisations. So I suppose we just wanted to pick up that baton and take it forward. So one of the other things that prompted us to do this was the graph that we created for the Healthy Street Scorecard, which shows the proportion of streets under controlled parking in each London borough. And as you can see, it's hugely varied. So we have, I think now 5 or 6 boroughs with 100% controlled parking, but many with below 50%, and even one London borough, Lewisham, at about 20%. So that said to us that there was a huge opportunity to take action. So local authority parking policy is really partly about the outcomes that we're looking for around the things that I've talked about. So those are the things on the left there. And on the right, we're talking more about what physically or specifically we're actually talking about. So we're talking about parking controls around curbside and charging. We're talking about whether that space can be reallocated for other important things. We need to talk about privately owned land, so workplaces, even front gardens might be included in that. Retail parks might be included in that. Even you could include housing estates, although we have tended to regard that as kind of residential parking, but it is in effect private land. It's an incredibly important link to pavements, and I'm going to come on to all of that. And also, obviously, we need to think about new development and whether it's car-free or car light, so that you don't provide any parking at all apart from disabled parking. Car light, which might be provide one parking space for every three households. But also in the local plan, in the context of the local plan, moving away from car-dependent retail, for example. So there are a lot of areas within the local authority role that you might not immediately think about. So here they are. They are the local highway and local traffic authority, controlling parking on residential streets and at town centres, etc. They are the managers of housing estates, although they're not the only managers of housing estates. Obviously, lots of social housing is managed by social landlords. But for example, in somewhere like Hackney, where I live, something like 40 to 50% of housing is social housing. So this is extremely important in the mix. They are the owner, or can be the owner and operator of public car parks. They are the local planning authority, so they would be responsible for setting the parking levels in new developments and, for example, working to change a big retail park with lots of surface car parking into something else. They're also responsible for front garden parking. They are the local transport authority, which means they have powers to introduce local workplace parking levies. And also they are employers themselves, and so they run workplaces, and they can show leadership, or they could show leadership by encouraging their own employees, or for example teachers in schools, to not drive to work, or to support them to find other ways to get to work. So I'm now going to start to go through all of those in a little bit more detail, but don't panic, because most of what I've got now is photographs, with the exception of a couple of slides. So, so this is one of the exceptions. So at the heart of urban planning is the question of whether we go for a compact city, which may have a green belt around it to ensure it's a compact city, as we do in London. The opposite of that would be urban sprawl. So compact cities are characterised by high density housing. They're low carbon. They are places where public transport is or should be financially viable and work well. It should support active travel, which in itself supports health. And it is a climate safe environment in the sense that both transport is efficient and effective, public transport is efficient and effective, and there is enough green space to absorb water and to reduce temperatures. So on the opposite side, urban sprawl is low density, high carbon, car dependent. It does not support active lifestyles, and it is de facto a climate unsafe environment. I've got a couple of links at the bottom there where you can see where we've talked more about that. Where the bottom one is where we, cpre London, have talked more about. The one above it is a link to a paper I just came across recently, which was really interesting. And this is a couple of pages from it, which shows household densities. So on the left, you have 25 dwellings per hectare, which is a very low density. On the right, you have 69 dwellings per hectare, which is high, just about high enough density to support a bus. So most people would say that to support bus services, you need to be looking at something above 60 dwellings per hectare. So you can see that even though they might look a bit similar, those two settings, they're very different. And importantly, neither of them have big blocks of flats or high rises, which is often what people, particularly in suburban contexts, get very concerned about. We've done a lot of work on density and trying to promote the idea that actually density can be very good for a community. You can find that on the link that I put on the page above that. So this is the issue around planning. So this is a car park in Enfield. It's linked to the A10 retail park in Enfield on the A10, and it's part of it is working towards planning permission for basically a whole new town, mixed use development, obviously. So yeah, so there's quite a lot of high rise there, but and probably higher than we would have supported. But basically what we're talking about is making much better use of space and reducing dependence on cars for retail in that part of London. So yeah, controls. So now we're moving on to controls and charges. So the fundamentals about controlling parking are that fewer people drive. So this is an image of, it's actually a housing estate. It's not a road. It's a housing estate, but these are the before and after pictures from when controlled parking was introduced. And in the before, obviously, you can see a huge number of people parking in where they're not meant to. They're double parking. They were even parking on access gates, so emergency access gates, and so dangerous parking as well. And so you see in the bottom very clearly that there were people parking there who didn't live there, so it's being used for commuter parking. This is just a housing estate that I just kind of found randomly on Google. It just shows that, you know, if parking isn't controlled, people basically will park anywhere. and it's really just to make the point that parking on estates, housing estates, is as important as parking on as controlling parking on roads, residential streets, controlling curbside parking there. So just front garden parking and private land. So I've put here some of the problems with front garden parking, partly that householders can avoid parking controls and costs, but that also you have to introduce a pavement crossover, which makes for an uneven pavement. Crossovers can cause danger with cars driving across pavements. And front gardens have to be paved, although you can use a permeable surface. And finally, it just doesn't look great. It's basically an eyesore. And increasingly, the problem is that cars are so big now that they stick out over the pavement, and that isn't allowed. So that is partly a question of enforcement. This is a stretch of private land in front of shops. So the council will struggle to be able to control this as long as they've enabled a crossover the footway. So they can control footway, so pavement crossovers, but they can't stop people from parking on private land. And this is a good example of a piece of land where often, near my house, where often I see between 8 and 10 cars parked. The mini supermarket there, the Clapton Express, puts out cones because, you know, it wants people to be able to see its shop and go in easily without difficulty. This is a part of the playground in a primary school, which my son used to go to, and which has kind of just turned into a car park for teachers, I presume, or for staff. It's not to say that, you know, that parking shouldn't be provided for teachers. It's really just to say that This is almost certainly happening without either the knowledge or the say-so of the council, or if they have, there's no move has really been made to try to encourage or discourage parking. It's just there, it's just happening, and it's just kind of taken over part of the car park, part of the playground. Although this particular school does have a big playground. So just wanted to talk a bit about improving the public realm and supporting the local economy. So these are two pictures, a before and after of a street, which is one of my favourite pictures, actually. And it seems really simple, but actually, I think the reason that I like this picture is just because it talks to the issue of how things look. And I think this is like always bottom of the agenda is, does it look nice? Obviously, it's whether something looks nice may not be as important as whether it is accessible or whether it has green infrastructure, whether it supports walking or cycling. But actually, when something looks nice, it is important to people, and it's important to me, and it's important to our sense of well-being. So this picture I like because it's reclaimed some parking for trees, and it makes the space look much nicer, and it's reduced a bit of parking space so that we're reclaiming a bit of space and stopping hopefully a few people making a few trips in cars. This is I could have taken a million examples of where public realm could be improved, and this one is just an interesting one, Somerset House, which used to be a car park and is now a fantastic piece of urban realm. Then moving on to talk about the economy, obviously, there's many times you hear people talk about, if we take away car parking from a town centre or a row of shops, those shops will not be able to survive. And this was just a quote that Simon Monk, who's part of London Cycling Campaign, put up on Twitter, just to say that, when they said that they were going to take parking away from this row of shops, there was a big campaign to stop that from happening, but it has happened, and now those shops are doing well, if not better, and it's a thriving place and a much nicer place. There's lots of work on that. I've just put the pedestrian pound on the right. That's a Living Streets publication. You can just look that one up. So pedestrians and safety. So this is kind of my favourite section. Pavements. What's the link between pavements and parking? Well, this is the most obvious one. So pavement parking is making walking much harder. That's a street in Lewisham. It's also making streets much less safe. So this is, I think, Southwark, where you can see that parking was taken away from one side of the street. And if you look on the right, you can just about see the yellow zigzags, which is where a school is. And so what you do by removing or controlling parking is you are basically enabling sight lines so that people can see much better, basically. And also it does look a bit better, although it would be nice to have some trees. So keeping pavements clear is really important. So here's on the left, you have a tree which has been placed on a pavement, making it really basically impassable. I would have thought if you're on, in a wheelchair, but you can maybe squeeze through, but obviously that's not going to be easy. We know that, we don't advocate chopping trees down because they're pavements, because they're causing obstructions. We advocate that new trees should go on a build out, as on the right, and all that at least 1.5 meters should be left, preferably 2 meters. Perhaps if you have a case like this where a tree has caused pavement damage, that you create a build out into the street to enable people to pass by. Street clutter of every kind you can imagine causes impediment, and really, there needs to be much more thought about where to put it. This is just a bunch of completely random signs which have just been plonked all over this island randomly. But I found the picture on the right of a street in Lewisham. I was passing by and I noticed that they put the parking signs discreetly against the wall there, so they're not just immediately creating a pavement impediment. Obviously EV infrastructure, lots of people talking about how that really should not be on the pavement. And so we've got the example on the right of it being placed on a build out there. So that's good. And also, I found this recently on Twitter, which is somebody saying, why are the bins on the street? Why aren't they on the road? So all of these things can take the place of parking, and make sure that we have pavements clear for walking. So making space for other things. So here we have a parklet. Well, it's what we might call a streetery, or a space for cafes, shops, pubs, even here, to put seating. So that's a before and after there, and that supports the local economy, so that we have evidence that shows that something like 20 to 30%, your income would go up by 20 to 30% if you're able to create a bit more space outside. Incredibly important now too to create spaces which are healthier outside. So those are a couple more parklets there. One is community parklet, also in Hackney. It's not specifically related to one shop, but it is supporting a cafe on the row of shops there. And then I just put in another quick picture of my own parklet, which is just on my residential street, and it's just flower beds, but it's looking very beautiful at the moment. I took this picture yesterday. You can put cycle hangers in parking spaces, and there's a big campaign at the moment trying to talk about how many people need spaces. There's a huge waiting list for cycle hangers. So very important that we use parking spaces for secure cycle parking. We can use parking spaces for green infrastructure. So this is the before and after. So the aerial shot shows the before, and then street view shows the after. So that's very exciting. Also in Hackney. Sorry, a lot of my pictures are always from Hackney because I live there. Bus lanes. So this is so the top picture is a street in Hackney, and the bottom left is the same street. So one stretch of it has a bus lane, another stretch of it has parking, and so just showing that you can create bus priority by removing parking. I was actually cycling the other day on Hackney Road, which is the picture on the bottom right, and noticed that there's parking on both sides of the road here, and it's a very big junction. It's where Hackney Road meets the A10, and I was really surprised that that parking hasn't been removed to create bus priority, and I think it really should. So in cases where you need loading bays, usually you can place them around the corner to make sure that people can still load for shops. This is a road in Hackney where parking was removed to create a cycle lane, which was originally just a drawn-on cycle lane, but has now got one, so secure a segregated cycle lane or protected cycle lane. And I should mention also, of course, that car share spaces can, parking for privately owned vehicles can give way to spaces for car share. So incredibly important to think about for new developments as well, where parking standards sometimes demand that you have to put in, for example, one space per household. But I think we feel strongly that you shouldn't have to do that if you can exchange that for car share spaces, and enable people to use car share schemes instead of using privately owned cars. And finally, this is a street that has been turned into a park. So not just a parklet, but an entire park. Obviously, we're using the carriageway as well as the parking spaces here. There is still access to the buildings, obviously, for emergency services, and that's Alfred Place in Camden. So it's very exciting that scheme has actually been completed, and we're calling for every borough to create 30 of these to tackle green space deficiency in areas where there's not enough green space, of which there are very many in London. So, time for change. It's one of the most important tools available to local authorities. It's not being used enough, and we need councils to urgently review their policies and take action, not just review their policy. I'll come back to what I think those should be right at the end, and Will is now going to take you through the benchmark before handing over to Rick. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alice. Hello, everybody. My name is Will, and I've been working for cpre London recently on putting together this benchmark parking policy that Alice has been talking about. So what I'm going to do now is talk you through that a little bit. Basically, it brings together all the wonderful things that Alice has been talking about and showing you pictures of into actual policy suggestions. And we've created an assessment tool, the idea of which is that anybody who wants to assess whether their local authorities parking policies are up to scratch can basically use this as a kind of checklist and go through. So I'm going to show you that. I just want to talk a little bit, I want to sort of visualize how we've decided what is and isn't parking policy, because as you will have seen, there was a lot of stuff in there. It's a kind of maximalist approach, if you like. Basically, we're looking at two groups of things, one of which is places we leave our cars, and the other of which is things we do at the side of the road. And those two overlap. And where that overlap is basically what I think a lot of people would go to when they think about parking policy, what it is. We're talking about parking enforcement officers, we're talking about parking permits, talking about pay and display machines, or in some cases, the complete absence of any of those things, which is problematic. But I think if you work for a local authority in parking services, this will probably be quite a lot of what you spend your time doing. So this is what people go to when they think of parking policy. But obviously, both those groups of things are much bigger than that and expand beyond that. So for example, things we do at the side of the road, and you've seen pictures of all these things now, cycle storage, including importantly for adaptive and non-standard cycles, for cargo bikes, planting betrees, very important for making places nicer, also for reducing the urban heat island effect and kind of providing a barrier between people and traffic. Parklets and seating, again, just stuff that makes the roadside a nicer place for people to spend time, because these are basically the places where we live. EV charging, again, there's some issues around this, but this is definitely something that could go at the side of the road. And finally, pedestrian space. So all these things are kind of in competition with parking, and that's why we think they should be included in parking policy. Like, you could choose to put parking in, or you could choose to put these things in. That's basically why we think they should be included in any assessment of parking policy. And then expanding the group of places we leave our cars, public car parks provided by local authorities, destination parking, so retail could be supermarkets, retail parks, leisure, so cinemas, sports stadiums, and transport. Because not all of these will be under the control of local authority, but there are ways that they can have some influence over these things, which we'll come to in a little bit. Then we've got workplace parking, so that again, that could be local authorities, including schools and council offices, or it could be private offices. And then finally, massive one of these is off-street residential parking. So that includes estates, where, depending on where you live, might be a very large proportion of residences. Front gardens, as Alice talked about, people convert their front gardens to parking, which has numerous problems associated with it, and new developments as well. So all these things we think are a parking policy. And then I'm aware this is not exactly how Venn diagrams are supposed to work, but when you apply the things on the right to the places on the left, you also have parking policy. So for example, we might be talking about cycle storage on estates, or we might be talking about repurposing supermarket car parks to make green space. But basically, in our assessment tool, all these things are included under the subject of parking policy. One of the things that you might come across as a campaigner on this is that those two groups aren't managed by the same council departments, which can be a problem when you're trying to make change happen, basically. But I'll come to an actual example of that in a bit. So this is the a little view of the assessment tool that I've been working on for CPRE. The idea of this is that campaigners, but also people who work for local authorities, or anybody who wants to basically assess a local authority's parking policy, can just go through this and treat it as a checklist. So we tried to make it as sort of straightforward and easy to use as possible, hence the color coding. And we've got 45 different policies, which are divided into 10 areas. And the idea is that each area gets a score depending on how many of those policies are present. So if all the policies or all but one of them are present, it gets a good score. If it's half or more, then it gets a score of needs improvement. And if it's less than half, then we consider that to need urgent action. And that gets colored in bright angry red color. So I'm just going to whiz through those 10 areas. You already have heard a lot about the things in them. I'm going to pull out just a few that I think deserve a little bit of special mention. So principles and vision. This kind of relates to what Alice was saying about the why of parking policies. Like, what are we doing this for? So there are statutory things that local authorities have to do with parking. So they have to provide adequate parking, and they have to, I think there's a duty to keep traffic flowing. We think they've probably got those covered, but obviously there is a lot more that we think parking could and should be doing. So hopefully if anyone here is assessing a local authority's parking policy, there'll be a document that has a nice clear introduction called something like the principles of parking policy, and it will hopefully have these things on it. But the one I wanted to highlight, which I have not seen anywhere, we think is really important, is that parking policy is fair for everybody, not just for car owners. Like, this is absolutely never mentioned, weirdly, because there are always people who don't own cars, and in some local authorities that's a clear majority of people, and yet you never see the fact that parking policy has an impact on non-car owners discussed. So we really want to see people understand that point and put that front and center in their campaigning and their policies. Controlled parking zones. The thing I wanted to pull out here is that, as you will have seen from the graph of the Healthy Streets scorecard, there are some London boroughs that have 100% parking, controlled parking coverage. However, what they do at 3 of those cases, and I've picked on one of them here, is they have one enormous controlled parking zone. So basically, if you're coming from outside the borough, it functions like a controlled parking zone. If you live inside the borough, it basically doesn't, and you can go and park anywhere. So if a local authority is introducing controlled parking zones, it's really important that they follow the best practice on this, which is to have lots of little zones. And that way, basically, you can't go and park anywhere you like in the borough. We want to, sort of name and shame to an extent to make sure that that message gets through. Cost of parking. So I think we would probably all recognise when parking is too cheap and understand the problems associated with that. We wanted to quantify that in order to make it easy to assess them. We've alighted on the figure of £150 a year for minimum, the minimum cost of car parking. So that will probably be a zero emissions car, if there's a proper sort of grading structure according to admissions. The figure of £150, it's what VED costs if you're paying for a year's parking. There are several London boroughs, at least, that already charge £150 a year for some cars. So we don't think this is, an attempt to price people out of ownership, but it still feels like a significant sum, and it should do. And then related to this is the cost of cycle storage, which this is kind of an injustice that, once you've seen, can't really be unseen. A bike takes up 1/6 the space of a car. So absolutely fundamental to this, sort of fairness is that the minimum price for a car is at least 6 times the price for storing a bicycle. There is no London borough that manages to achieve this. Some of them come quite close. Enfield, really impressive. £12 a year cycle storage, that seems reasonable. And we would like the price of their cheapest parking permit to be a bit more expensive, but it does come quite close to that 6-to-1 ratio. At the other end of the scale, Islington. Now, this is not the worst, because the worst London boroughs don't have any cycle storage, so there would be no blue line on that graph. But I think this deserves pulling out as London's most expensive cycle storage. I think it's £107 for a year, which is kind of extraordinary. I mean, imagine that you are a family of 2 parents and 3 kids. We're looking at like over £500 a year to store your bicycles on the street, which is just extraordinary, given that that is also about the same as the most expensive polluting car. So you could just get the diesel SUV, or get taxis everywhere. So yeah, Islington very good on lots of things, but that seems like a bit of an anomaly. Electric vehicles, as Alice said, there is the problem with putting infrastructure on the pavement. But we also want to see recognition that although EVs are better than petrol cars, they are far from being a sustainable form of transport. And if there is some sort of hierarchy of use of curbside space, they should not be at the top of it. Walking and cycling, car clubs should all be above EVs. This is a problem for all environmental campaigners, I think, because we recognize that EVs will be important in the transition. But I think it's absolutely crucial that we say, first of all, we want to reduce driving, and that driving which remains, we want to replace with electric vehicles. And I think it's really important that gets built into parking policy. Accessibility, I'm actually going to skip over this because, as Alice mentioned, we're lucky to have Rick Rodgers from Wheels for Wellbeing, who's going to talk a little bit about that area of parking policy later on. So I'm going to move over that. Short stay parking, this includes a call for a workplace parking levy, which I don't think any London borough has imposed. As far as I know, only Nottingham in the UK has imposed a workplace parking levy, and I'd be really interested to know a little bit more about how it's worked. But I think it's basically like funded quite a lot of public transport stuff. We've asked London boroughs to look at this, and there's been pretty much sort of stonewalling on that. But we think it's about the only way that they can control quite a lot of the private parking that goes on. So I mean, it seems pretty essential. We want to reduce parking, and we want a target for that, and we want a sort of a fixed time frame. I think this is a little bit of a problem sometimes, that the people who run parking services don't always have control over the amount of parking, and it's a bit of a problem with a sort of lack of joined up thinking. But yeah, we definitely want to see, if it's necessary to reduce driving, and a lot of local authorities agree it is. We know that parking generates driving, therefore it seems pretty logical that you need to reduce parking in order to have a big effect on that. Pedestrian environment, yeah, again, we just want to draw attention to the stuff that goes, could go on the road and take away space from parking, is actually going on the pavement and is making pavements more cluttered. This is a kind of things that we do at the side of the road sort of feature. Again, active, shared and sustainable travel, this is all stuff that is competing for space with parking. And so, as I think we heard at the beginning, it's about priorities, really. And finally, estate parking. Again, this will vary massively depending on the local authority. And apologies if this has been quite London-centric so far, but there are definitely London boroughs where getting on for 50% of residents live on estates. So that's the basic call here is that estate parking is treated in the same way as on-street parking and is not forgotten about. So that means charging for it, basically, controlling it and recognizing that it needs that control. So that's the assessment tool. I just wanted to leave you with a little bit of a kind of a real life example of some parking campaigning that we've done. So this is going to be not only London centric, but again very Hackney centric, for which I also apologise. Last year, Hackney Council consulted on a new 5-year parking and enforcement plan. This, as a campaigner, this was my first ever sort of deep dive into borough's parking policy. So quite a lot of this has informed the way we shaped the assessment tool that we've done. It was a long document, it's hundreds of pages, and the consultation was complicated as well. So really, we just wanted to find a way as campaigners to make it as easy as possible for members of the public to engage with this quite, complicated, in-depth look at parking policy. And also to get people who aren't car owners interested in it, because I think another problem is that people who don't own cars quite often think that parking policy is nothing to do with them. And as I hope we've shown, that's absolutely not the case. So as a starting point, Hackney is quite a good London borough for this kind of thing. It scores well on most of the Healthy Streets scorecard metrics. It's got 90% or something controlled parking zone coverage. The price of parking could be more expensive, but it's kind of mid-table London boroughs. And all new developments are car free, which is great. So we had some hopes for this policy. One of the really good things in the new policy was that they were proposing to put a massive surcharge on diesel vehicles, which is going to ramp up to £400 a year over the course of 5 years, which to us really demonstrated a commitment to reducing the number of the most polluting vehicles on the road. We thought that was great. And also this document included the principle that an hour's public parking should always cost more than a return bus fare, which we thought was so good that made it as a policy into the assessment tool. Bad thing in here was massive concessions for electric vehicle owners that we were actually quite horrified by. So Hackney was proposing to make parking permits for electric vehicles free, down from £10 a year currently to free. And we just thought, we understand the need to get people to transition to electric cars, but I don't think they need this much help. And you're just going to create a massive expectation amongst EV owners that they will be able to park for free, which is going to make it really, really hard to reverse later. So we thought that was going to be absolutely disastrous. They undermined their excellent policy on the cost of public parking by offering 50p an hour parking for electric vehicles. And again, just an unnecessary concession, I think. Charge more for petrol vehicles, but start EVs as your baseline of slightly more than a bus fare. And then to add insult to injury, they were going to create a roaming permit for EV owners, which meant that basically between the hours of 10 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, if you had an EV permit, you could go and park in any other controlled parking zone. So I mean, if you want traffic, this is how you get traffic, just sort of completely undermining a lot of the good work. And then there was some slightly disappointing conceptual stuff. Like there was nothing about workplace parking levy, as we've mentioned, and missing really the big picture stuff about reducing parking. Even though they were quite good on recognizing the role that parking policy plays in tackling climate change, improving air quality, did not take that extra step and just say, therefore we're going to reduce parking. So that's what we were looking for. And in order to try and help people engage with this, we created this little guide. As you can see, that's about 31 different questions there. But we pulled out the things that we thought were most egregious. And we said, if you've only got 1 minute to do this consultation, please just tick strongly disagree to these things. And if you've got 2 minutes, also tick strongly agree to these things that we thought were good. And we figured that there probably wouldn't be an enormous number of people doing this consultation. And therefore, if we could push a handful of people to do it using these guidelines, hopefully that would have a big impact. And so the reason I bring this up is because this is kind of circular. So this document from Hackney informed my thinking about parking. And although the sort of primary aim of our assessment tool is that campaigners can use it you can assess a borough's parking policy absolutely anytime you like. It's never too soon. Specifically, it will be useful if there is a consultation and you get presented with a massive, great document and you need to know how to make sense of this and work out, if it's doing its job properly. So that's it from me. Thanks very much for listening. I'm now going to hand over to Rick Rodgers from Wheels for Wellbeing, who shows us he hasn't got any slides. So thanks for patiently looking at all the slides.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I mean, I got given a 5-minute slot, so I decided that you can all see my face instead of looking at slides and being bored by pictures. So I just wanted to start by saying, obviously I'm here to talk about accessible parking, including accessible cycle parking for disabled people and non-standard cycles like cargo bikes. And to give a little bit of a reminder on the data, disabled people currently 20% of our society, 15 to 20% of the world's population, depending on how you count it. And that's often not taking into account the older generations who have similar needs in terms of their balance and capabilities, needs to drive, needs in terms of moving longer distances. So when we're looking at inclusive parking, we need to take those numbers into account. Currently, blue badge parking there's a kind of policy requirement that 5% of parking spaces are available for blue badge holders. And now, especially when we're taking away inaccessible or non-specifically accessible parking spaces and spaces away from blue badge holders, we need to remember that disabled people are much more likely to rely on being driven and driving themselves, much less likely to be able to effectively use public transport. So in a way, we need to still consider blue badge parking and opportunities for disabled people and their carers to get close to locations. Now, there are other options of helping these, making better accessible public transport, making options for inclusive cycle parking and things like that. But it's often, when we take away an option, like in York, it's often the blue badge parking that goes first. Over the COVID, when we put all the street furniture out and made extra long lines, it was the disabled bays that went first. So that needs to be taken into account. When you're looking at policies to create parking spaces and we need to look at appropriate surfacing. London Borough of Bromley a couple of years ago redid their high street surfacing and put cobbles behind every one of their accessible parking spaces. So you'd have to take your wheelchair out onto a cobbled space. So obviously there was no real consultation on that process, and co-production is really important. Someone in the chat was like, how can we get more understanding of disability into these policy places? And something we campaign about is co-production. Find opportunities to bring disabled people's voices into these planning discussions, into council, into positions of power, so that they can help planners, help designers understand the needs that the disabled community have and start co-producing that work. I think it's great to improve local shopping opportunities rather than creating these big out of town centres where they rely on driving, because that does support the disabled community, who are twice as likely to be physically inactive than their non-disabled counterparts. So helping and encouraging people to get out and get down to their local shops rather than having to drive to a larger shop is important. However, we also need to think about those shops rather than just the parking and the street furniture. The shops themselves, are we encouraging and making sure that those are accessible? Because at the moment, reasonable adjustments are often not reasonable for those who need them. The reasonability focuses on whether a shop can afford it, or whether they can be bothered a lot of the time, or whether they've yet been sued. And I think we need to flip that thought process as well when we're looking at street furniture. And to encourage people to go to local high streets, we also need to look at the shops and make sure those shops are accessible, make sure that they have ramps, that they're wide enough in their corridors so that disabled people can get around okay. In terms of road furniture and charging, the picture that Alice showed of that tree, as a wheelchair user, I know I wouldn't be able to get past that safely. And I think that, it's very appropriate to ask for the kind of widening of that road to 1.5 meters. In the LTN 120 document, which was for Wellbeing's data, had a lot of input in. 1.2 to 1.5 meters passing space for wheelchairs, non-standard cycles is now the norm. So what we need to do is we need to start making changes to historic spaces as well as the new spaces that are being built. For inclusive and non-standard cycle parking, one of the big challenges is that current parking facilities for cyclists aren't including disabled people at all. And this stuff gets really frustrating after a while when we've had the Disability Discrimination Act for the last 30 years, and yet cycle hangers, which are kind of the standard and the norm, don't take into account the needs of non-standard cycles. They don't take into account the needs of disabled people at all. So when you're putting cycle parking in place, consider leveling the curb to get to that parking environment, so that we drop the curb to get access to those spaces, that they're light enough to lift and close appropriately, and that they have through access, because a lot of non-standard cycles and disabled people's cycles don't reverse. It's not, when I get into my hand cycle, it's not like I can just jump out and pull it out of the parking and then climb into it. I need to climb into it in the parking space. I need to somewhere to store my wheelchair whilst I'm on my cycle, and then I need to go forwards out of that parking provision a lot. So something that we promote in our cycle parking training that we do for local organisations is creating kind of side-on cycle parking on the off-street area that has low bar, so that those incumbents, cargo cycles, hand cycles can still attach their cycle appropriately and can enter and exit the area without having to reverse at all. But just to reiterate, LTM 120 has got a lot of good data about this stuff now. They're saying that you need about a 3 meter turning circle, and I can definitely agree that is the case. And that 1.5 meters pass through is really important. So please consider that, and please consider co-production when you're working on these things. Organisations like Wheels for Wellbeing, Wheels for Me are open to talking to people when you're making these decisions, and hopefully we can catch them before they get put out into the world and have to then be updated later or adjusted. Over to Alice. I hope that was your 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Rick. Yeah, in fact, we're very nearly at 1:30. I think that was mainly because I took a very long time, so sorry about that. But I just wanted to kind of end with one slide, but I was just going to say, there's a huge amount of stuff here, but I think what we're trying to say is that there are things that can be and need to be done right now. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit here. So we've done a lot of talking about, for example, the workplace parking levy, and frankly, we could probably talk about it for another 20 years, and most local authorities would probably not do very much about it. But we can do lots of stuff about controlling parking in, for example, that in the London Borough that has only got 20% of streets controlled. And we can do a lot to replace parking with green infrastructure and that kind of thing. I'm just going to put this slide up. Slide up quickly, just to say quickly what I think those things are. So controlling parking, making sure estates are treated the same as residential parking on residential streets that are not estates. Create targets to reduce space, to redeploy it for other things, including for decluttering pavements. To end pavement parking really straight away, right now. No more enabling of front garden parking, so bring in that policy to no more front garden parking planning permissions and no more footway crossovers. Estates, I've put in that twice, and using that influencing role, for example, by not enabling driving at council workplaces. So that's it. We really don't want to appear as just people who want to talk about policy. We want to see action, and we think there's lots that can happen right now. Yeah, so Jeremy, over to you. Have you got some good questions for us? But yeah. I should just say we're here for another 15 minutes for people who can. So we know that many of you might be able to go.
Yeah, so there was a huge number of really good points made in the discussion, but I think one of the biggest issues came around parking and planning policy, and the nice thing about this is a bit sort of less London focused, really. So Scott Richardson started the conversation going where he said, we at East Riding Council are looking at reviewing our local plan. My question is, would you look at adopting a minimum or maximum parking standards? And then Rachel Leggett made a really interesting point saying a home with 2 working parents and 2 working grown-up children in a rural setting it's really difficult to deal with national standards. And how do you go beyond that? And then Katie Rodder then said, how would we sort of look to have denser developments? We need rural development to be building new small new towns. And that's what happened on the continent, properly linked instead of suburb after suburb. And Jenny then said, if you're expanding places not around the car, you need to invest in light rail, trams, metro, etc. So I think that was the kind of territory, and I think it'd be really interesting to get people's comments around that.
Right, so I think that's probably mostly me. So that's really why I started with the issue of density. And the absolutely close link to your local plan has to be underpinned by a local transport plan. So in London, the London plan is underpinned by the Mayor's transport strategy. The local plans have to give regard to that. So that's absolutely fundamental. I spoke to a man in Oldham recently who's in the council, who is a planner, very frustrated, talking about 2 cars per household as the absolute standard. And I said, well, I know that this is difficult. But you can, you've got to start somewhere, I think, is the answer. So that you've got to take the big picture, but you can also start to control parking, to take parking spaces away, and incremental removal of parking spaces from destinations in particular does help. And I know cities like in Denmark and in Amsterdam, I think there are a couple of examples, Copenhagen, where they removed parking from the town centre incrementally to start to get that process going. There's no one simple answer to this, but parking standards, you can't tackle parking standards alone. It's got to be part of a bigger picture. I don't think I can say any more than that, unless others have, can put that in the chat. Hope that's helpful.
Any other contributions from the speakers, or is that Alice covered that well enough?
I think Alice has covered that very well.
Lovely. Okay, so just a sort of late question here from Tanya Sadefi, who says buses are few and far between outside London and trains are ridiculously expensive. If we reduce the number of cars, do we not need to campaign for much, much better and cheaper transport at a national level? Otherwise, how will people get around?
Absolutely. Essentially, we're planning for cars at the moment. We can't plan for sustainable transport unless we think about the density of development, where we're putting development, and how people are going to travel. So for me, the local plan and the transport plan need to be written together. It's just that simple. I have frequently shown people the spreadsheet which shows the proportion of people who don't own a car, so the proportion of households that don't own a car. And although in London it's very high, in inner London boroughs it's up as high as 70%, there are very few places where there are no households. So it's usually somewhere around 20%, a fifth of households are usually trying to get around without a car. So it's already a massive problem, but we're not planning for those people. We're not planning to try to shift things. So there does need to be a change, but I don't want it to leave feeling that there's nothing that can be done. I just feel like, when I'm talking to fellow cpre campaigners in Birmingham or Manchester, and they're looking at greenbelt developments, and I'm saying, it's absolute fundamental that we have to start building on those vast brownfield sites that are basically right in the middle of Birmingham or Manchester or Leeds or Bradford or wherever it is. If we don't do that, we're just recreating the problem.
I'd just like to add to that. I think obviously planning for public transport is immensely important and is a big and expensive task. But we should also always remember that in urban areas, at least, quite a lot of car journeys are short distances. I think something like a third of London car journeys are 2 kilometres or under, which means they could be walked in 20 minutes. Obviously, not all those journeys could be walked for other reasons. But that planning for walking is also a really, really important way of how we're going to reduce car journeys and reduce the need for parking as well.
Yeah, and I think in terms of that kind of understanding the difference between those who need to and those who don't need to use vehicles is really important. I think once we reduce the use of vehicles for those who can do that 20-minute walk, then we're in a much better position to then start looking at supporting how do we support those who still need vehicles, and reducing traffic supports those individuals too.
Sorry, it would also be remiss of me not to mention the fact that in London we've got regulated transport, whereas in the rest of the country it's deregulated. So anybody, the bus services are just pretty much, unplanned. That's not helpful. Just recently, I mean, if I had my way, we would re-regulate buses immediately, and there should really be a big campaign to do so. There are certainly mayors. So the Mayor of Manchester has recently won at a court, I think it was a Court of Appeal judgment, because he was challenged on trying to take control of buses or rail. Sorry, somebody else might have the details, and he won, and that's unbelievably important and extraordinary that we live in a place where, you know, where people are prepared to take something to court to try to undermine a move to organise transport better. Just extraordinary.
Brilliant, thanks for that. So I've got a question here from Lara Parisotto. Of course, we all know there's a lot of discontent from car owners about the reduction of car parking. Is there any information about the behavioural change towards more active travel? How to encourage drivers to make that transition? And how long does it take for people to adapt? And how can we ease that adaptation process?
Well, Jeremy, you might know more about that than me. I mean, I think from our perspective, it's push and pull. So what we're trying to say is that you know, you do need to restrict parking and make it difficult, but you also need to make public transport, walking and cycling easier. But actually, there's a relationship between making those things easier and parking, because you can use the space that is there for parking now for improving public transport, walking and cycling.
Okay, lovely. Question from Ruth. I think this is more targeted at you, Rick, if that's okay. As wheelchair users, if there were proper or safe cycle lanes, could that not negate the need for car use in some instances, especially as with a hand cycle wheelchair, this can go directly into the shop? Any thoughts on that, Rick?
So, yeah, I mean, there is definitely an argument, and it's something that we argue at Wheels for Wellbeing all the time, to support more inclusive cycling to enable those people who can transition into cycles to do so. There's a lot of barriers in the way, including the cost of inclusive, like my hand cycle costs more than a secondhand car, for instance. So that makes it a big problem. And you know, there are many people who don't feel safe, comfortable doing cycling inclusively right now. And so we need to work out ways to support them in their transition, whilst also enabling in their current position of not being comfortable cycling to get around and interacting with society. I think there's also the challenge that, like I said, you know, a hand cycle has a 3-meter turning circle, and you can't necessarily take a wheelchair with you when you're hand cycling. I have a hand cycle, but I can only cycle for leisure, because once I'm in it, I can't then go anywhere else. So we need solutions available for that, because at the moment, if I wanted to go to a shop and take my hand cycle into that shop needs to have 1.5 meter wide corridors for me to move my cycle down in the first place, and then 3-meter turning circles minimum for me to get around the shop, which is just not possible. So there are some people who, once they've transitioned into a hand cycle, they're doing that for leisure and fitness activities. They're not able to then transition out again in an appropriate way.
Brilliant, thanks, Rick. I've got a couple of slightly more technical points here from Scott Richardson and Jessica Wilson. Is there any policy or guidance for the size of an EV parking space? And Scott says, having used an EV, I found that given the charging platform is not within the space, then a standard 2.5 by 5 meters is sufficient. But I've read that there could also be dimensions of 2.6 times 5 and also 3 by 5. So a bit more, is there any sort of guidance around those issues?
Oh, that is quite technical. A 3-meter wide parking space would be extraordinary. I think I'm pretty sure that's above like what the UK legal road markings allow for the width of a parking space. So I mean,
just to jump in, William, I saw recently there is a publication coming out shortly that is that's trying to better define EV parking spaces and their arrangement sizes. I can't tell you the specifics, but
okay. We think they might be bigger. I mean, like, I know that, you know, EVs have to accommodate enormous batteries, which for an equivalent car will probably take up a bit more space. Sorry, just to turn off a quick coughing attack there. I'm afraid I don't have any more technical knowledge about the size of EV car parking spaces, but yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's something that we should be on the lookout for. I don't know, is that also partly an accessibility question, like sort of making sure that EV chargers are accessible to everybody?
And that would be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Brenda just posted in the chat, thanks Brenda, that there's guidance on EV charging spaces and infrastructure that she can send. So we'll make sure that we create a link to that somewhere.
Yeah, it's draft at the moment. It's not finalized, but there's work being done on this area. So I was looking, I don't know where it is. It's somewhere. It's a few months ago. So I've got to find where it is, where I filed it. So it's just back filing at the moment. So I was going to send it. If I can do it before the meeting closes, I'll do that. But
thank you. So we got a couple more minutes. So Jeremy, was there anything else there?
Yeah, just a nice one from Luis Juarez, which is, could you touch on the case of seasonal parking, such as tourism spots that receive a lot of visitors and cars on holiday breaks and, in the holiday season, and just how you vary parking usage and cost, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And obviously being London based, we think that a lot of what we have to say does have meaning for the rest of the country, but that particular one is tricky. I think that we would always advocate that there needs to be an alternative way to get to that place. Like national parks often have great bus services and do restrict parking or charge a lot for it, and that's probably a good thing, but it's not my area of expertise, and we haven't really done, as Will called it, a deep dive into that specific area of parking policy.
Yeah, we need some kind of seasonal parklets, don't we, that can be kind of rolled out to occupy car parking spaces in the winter, and then in the summer they can, I don't know, migrate or something like that.
Yeah, and then just one, again, a nice sort of a slightly more technical point here from Ulrika Kern. Is anyone aware why new developments, even high-density ones, seem to avoid any underground parking provision, usually with a developer using a cost argument? Is excavation work really that much more costly than in the UK than in cities and some other countries?
I think I'm going to answer that quickly, because that's a big question that's probably better answered by designers. But yes, it is costly to dig down. In London, we would not be, we would be advocating that would be zero car anyway. So we would not want to be advocating for basement car parking. It is a better use of space than surface car parking, but ultimately we're trying to eliminate parking. So we've actually hit 1:45 now. So I just want to say thanks so much to everybody for coming. That's a huge audience, and we're just so excited that everybody's actually talking about parking now. My life has been so glamorous over the last few months thinking about parking, but it is unbelievably important, and we really are going to have to see lots of action. So the more anyone can do, whether as a designer or as a campaigner or as a local authority officer or councillor, to really look at this issue and take action, then the better, frankly. And so thanks very much to Jeremy for taking the questions, for Will for his support on this project and for doing the speech today, and to Rick for joining us as well. And thanks to the Urban Design Group for hosting us. Thanks very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.